What would you do if you're on a fishing trip with your kids, your best friend, and their children, and suddenly you all end up in the water, struggling to stay afloat? With no one around to help and the cold water making it harder to hold on, you're faced with an impossible choice. Try to save the children and risk your own life, or swim for help and hope they survive long enough to be rescued. This was the heartbreaking decision one father had to make. This is the story of the 2012 Gairloch canoe tragedy. Garry McKay and Ewen Beaton were two best friends who had known each other for many years. They both lived near Inverness, Scotland, in the quiet villages of Muirvord and Bewley. Over time, their friendship had grown through shared experiences, one of which was their love of fishing. It was something they had done many times together, and on August 12, 2012, they decided to go on another fishing trip. But this time, it would be a little more exciting as they had brought their children with them. They planned to go fishing in Loch Gairloch, a sea loch on the northwest coast of Scotland. For anyone who's not familiar with the word, the name loch means lake or sea inlet in Scottish and Irish, and Gairloch means short loch is the name of the nearby village that sits along the shore of Loch Gairloch. The trip took them about an hour and a half from their homes to the coastal town of Gairloch. Once they arrived, both Garry and Ewen shared a single can of beer each before getting ready for their time out on the water. Ewen had brought along his Canadian canoe for the trip. This type of canoe, which was originally used by indigenous peoples in North America, is a very recognizable style. It has an open top and is paddled while sitting or kneeling. However, Canadian canoes can be quite unstable, especially when someone stands up inside one. This made them less ideal for choppy or unpredictable water conditions, and even more difficult to balance when there are children constantly moving inside. The group included Garry, Ewen, and their 5 children. Garry's daughters were 8-year-old Callie and 5-year-old Gracie. Ewen brought his 2 sons, 5-year-old Ewen Jr. and 2-year-old Jamie. All of the children were wearing buoyancy aids, which are similar to life jackets, but they serve a different purpose. Buoyancy aids are meant to help people who already know how to swim by helping them stay afloat and save energy. They are not designed to keep a person's head above water if they ever become unconscious. Life jackets, on the other hand, are made to do just that. Neither Garry nor Ewen were wearing any kind of flotation device. The average weather in the Gairloch area during August is generally mild. On average, the air temperature hovers around 18 degrees Celsius or about 64 degrees Fahrenheit. The water in Loch Gairloch during summer is colder, roughly 15 degrees Celsius or 59 degrees Fahrenheit. While that may not seem dangerously cold at first, staying in that water for too long can lead to hypothermia even during warmer months. Once everyone was in the canoe, they paddled about 500 meters out onto Loch Gairloch. Their goal was to reach a spot near Longa Island where they could spend the afternoon fishing. When they got there, things seemed to be going smoothly. The children were enjoying themselves, learning how to fish, and watching their fathers cast line into the water and bring fish into the canoe. At one point, Garry was sitting on the box they were using to hold the fish they caught. When he stood up to put a fish inside, the canoe suddenly tilted hard to one side and he nearly fell overboard. Garry told Ewen that just from standing up, the canoe had almost tipped over. He noted how unsteady the canoe felt. It was a cheaply made canoe and didn't balance well, and with the children moving around inside, the center of gravity kept shifting. That made the canoe even more unstable. But instead of heading back to shore, the two friends continued fishing. Later on, Ewen was pulling in another fish while Garry once again stood up to place a fish into the box. This time, the canoe tilted in the opposite direction, and it didn't recover its balance. The boat slowly capsized, flipping everyone into the water. Of the 7 people on board, only Garry and his older daughter Callie knew how to swim. The other children had to rely on their buoyancy aids to stay above water. Ewen did not have any flotation device and began struggling the moment he entered the water. For several minutes, everyone clung to the overturned canoe, trying to stay afloat. Garry tried to keep the situation calm and told everyone to hold on to the boat and wait for help. But as he looked around, he saw no other boats nearby. There were no houses in sight and no people on shore to see what was happening. Ewen's condition was getting worse. His two sons, who were panicking, had latched onto him tightly, which made it harder for him to stay afloat. The extra weight and movement caused him to lose his grip on the canoe and he slipped beneath the surface. He did resurface shortly after, but he was clearly exhausted and struggling. At that moment, Garry told Ewen's son to let go of their dad because they were unknowingly pulling him underwater. It's unclear exactly what happened to Ewen after that. Garry couldn't keep track of everyone while also trying to stay afloat himself. The last thing he saw was Ewen Jr. hugging his younger brother Jamie, who was now very pale. With no one around to help and the situation become more desperate, Garry made a difficult decision. He began swimming toward the shore to try to get help, leaving the children and Ewen behind. He hoped that someone would be nearby once he reached land and that they could send assistance quickly. It was a decision made in the moment under difficult circumstances and driven by the belief that calling for help was the only way to save the others. In a later interview, McKay shared what had gone through his mind when he made the decision to leave everyone behind and swim for help. He explained that, quote, "I wasn't sure I would make it to shore, but I thought that if I managed to get help, they would be okay because, although their bodies slowed down with the cold, children can survive for quite a long time in the sea. I didn't realize they were only wearing buoyancy aids, which don't keep your head out of the water if you lose consciousness." End quote. According to Garry, he felt he had no other option. He believed that if he stayed and tried to help everyone, he would likely drown as well. In a state of panic, his only thought was that he had to get help, and the only way to do that was to swim to the shore. At the time of the incident, the temperature in the water was about 15 degrees Celsius. While this may not seem extremely cold, it is still cold enough to cause serious problems. In those conditions, a healthy adult can usually stay in the water for around 30 to 60 minutes before hypothermia sets in. Once that happens, the body starts to lose heat faster than it can produce, and the person may become confused, weak, or lose consciousness entirely. For young children, the risk is even greater because their smaller bodies lose heat more quickly. Since 5-year-old Ewen Jr., 2-year-old Jamie, and 5-year-old Gracie were only wearing buoyancy aids, they would not have been protected if they passed out in the water. Without something to keep their heads above the surface, drowning was almost certain once hypothermia took hold. Trying to swim 500 meters while battling the cold temperatures, the time it would have been taken him to get to shore would have been quite long, especially when exhaustion and the effects of the cold starts to slow him down. As Garry began to swim, he heard his daughter call out to him and was also swimming back to shore. Callie had learned how to swim at school, and that training likely made the difference in her survival. Together, Garry and Callie swam the 500 meters back to shore. It was not an easy swim, especially after what they had just gone through, but they managed to make it. Callie was later praised for her courage to swim 500 meters back to shore, which no small task for a young girl. Once they reached the shore, the father and daughter quickly got separated. Garry immediately ran towards the nearest house, desperate to find help. He ended up in the back garden of Jim Aaron. Garry began shouting, telling Jim that their canoe had flipped over and that his friend and children were still in the water. Jim quickly realized the seriousness of the situation and began to call for more help. Neighbors soon joined in, and one of the people who responded was James Cameron, a local resident who also ran a nearby rental shop. James grabbed a friend and the two of them headed straight into the water to search for the others. Not long after they began searching, they found the body of 5-year-old Gracie. Although her body was still floating because of the buoyancy aid, her head was underwater and she was unresponsive. Shortly after, the bodies of Ewen Jr. and Jamie were also found in similar positions. All 3 children had been pulled from the water and rushed to the hospital. Unfortunately, by the time they arrived at the hospital, both Ewen Jr. and Jamie were confirmed to have lost their lives. Gracie, though unconscious, still had a very faint pulse. The doctors immediately began working to save her. For a brief moment, there was hope that she might survive, but the next day, the doctors confirmed that the damage caused by the lack of oxygen and the cold had been too severe. Both Garry and his wife got to hold Gracie in their arms one last time before she was taken off life support. Meanwhile, a search was launched to try and locate Ewen. Emergency services, Coast Guard teams, and volunteers began combing the area by boat and helicopter. They searched through the water around Loch Gairloch and nearby shores. The following day, weather conditions began to worsen, which made the operation much more difficult. At that point, it became clear to everyone involved that it was no longer a rescue mission, but a recovery effort. Despite continued searching for 2 full days, Ewen's body was never found. The incident left both families completely heartbroken. Ewen's wife lost her husband, whose body was never found, and their 2 young sons in a single afternoon. Garry lost his daughter and his closest friend. In the time after the accident, Garry spoke about the guilt he felt. Although he had tried to do what he thought was best, he struggled deeply with the thought that he was not able to save everyone. In the months and years that followed, Garry's life changed dramatically. He experienced ongoing emotional distress and developed what is commonly known as survivor's guilt. He found it difficult to move on from the tragedy and was often overcome with feelings of regret and helplessness. He began receiving psychiatric counseling to help cope with the trauma, but the memories of that day remained with him. In May of 2014, Garry was arrested for drunk driving. During the legal process, his lawyer explained that Garry had been suffering from depression and that the events of 2012 had taken a serious toll on his mental health. The court was told that he had not been the same person since the incident. Although this did not excuse the behavior, he was presented to provide context for what he had been going through. The loss experienced by both the McKay and Beaton family is something no one could have predicted. What began as a day of fishing between 2 lifelong friends and their kids ended in unimaginable heartbreak. Before we judge any of Garry's decisions, we have to understand the impossible situation he was in. As he later explained, if he had stayed in the water and tried to help his daughter and Ewen's sons, he believed he would have drowned too. Ewen himself ended up in that exact situation, struggling to stay afloat while his 2 young boys clung to him, pulling him under. Garry had no flotation device, and trying to keep 3 children above water while swimming 500 meters in cold conditions would have been nearly impossible. As a father myself, I ask what I would have done at that moment. As someone who knows how to swim, I believe I would have tried to bring the children as close to the shore as I could, even if it meant putting my own life at risk. Maybe that would have given them a better chance of surviving if they were closer, to which would cut the time rescuers would get to them. But the truth is, none of us can say for certain how we would react until we are in that situation ourselves. So I want to ask you, what would you have done? Would you stay and try to save the children, knowing it might cost your life? Or would you swim for help and hope that someone could reach them in time? If you made it all the way to the end, thank you. I put in a lot of effort into my videos and I always aim to give you the best experience possible. I would appreciate it if you can like, subscribe, and comment to help my videos get pushed to a wider audience so that one day I can offer you a much better experience. Again, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.